The call of the unseen. The biting winter wind howled through the dark streets, rattling against the windows of every building it passed, whispering secrets of the cold night to those who dared to listen. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, landing in soft piles along the sidewalk, untouched and pristine. The city slept in peace, but inside a small, dimly lit office on the second floor of the police precinct, Detective Ben Carter found no such comfort. He sat at his desk, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the half-empty cup of coffee in front of him. The steam had long since vanished, just like his energy, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. His mind was adrift, weighed down by exhaustion and an unshakable emptiness that had lived inside him for too long. It had been nearly 2 years since Sarah's accident, but the loss still felt fresh, like an open wound that refused to heal. A loud knock at his office door snapped him out of his trance. "Carter," came the familiar gruff voice of his captain. "We got a call from Mason Street Orphanage. Some kid went missing for a couple of hours earlier today. Found him hiding in the boiler room. Director wants us to check it out, just to be safe." Ben frowned, rubbing his temple. A missing kid, but they already found them. "Yeah, but the director insists something feels off," the captain replied, flipping through a folder. "And to be honest, I could use an extra pair of eyes. The orphanage has a history, kids slipping through the cracks, disappearing before paperwork catches up. Just take a look." Ben exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the armrests of his chair. He hadn't been to Mason Street Orphanage in years, not since his academy days, when he and his classmates had helped repaint the walls as part of a community service project. Back then, the place had seemed run down but hopeful. Now, he wasn't so sure. Still, what else did he have to do? Go home and stare at the empty side of his bed, drown in memories of a life that had vanished. "Fine," he muttered, pushing himself up from his chair. He grabbed his coat and his badge before stepping out into the frigid night air, heading toward the place where forgotten children lived. The iron gates of the orphanage stood tall and rusted, barely illuminated by a flickering street lamp. The old brick building loomed before him, its once warm red hues faded to a tired gray under the weight of time. Snow clung stubbornly to the edges of the windows, framing the cold glass like frostbitten scars. Ben approached the entrance and knocked twice. A moment later, the heavy wooden door groaned open, revealing a woman in her early 60s. Her sharp, weathered features softened slightly at the sight of him. "Detective Carter," she greeted, voice thick with fatigue. "I wasn't expecting you personally." "Director Grady," he acknowledged with a nod. "I heard about the situation. Mind if I take a look around?" She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The inside of the orphanage was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded paintings of children playing, their once bright colors dulled by time and neglect. The scent of old books and faintly burnt toast lingered in the air. "The child that went missing. What's the story?" Ben asked as they walked down the corridor. Grady hesitated, folding her arms. "Max, 7 years old. We found him in the basement, hiding behind the boiler. He wouldn't say a word when we pulled him out, just clung to his sister like his life depended on it." Ben raised an eyebrow. "His sister?" Grady nodded. "Mia, his twin. They came in together last year, abandoned at birth. They've been in and out of foster homes, but no one keeps them. Every time they're sent back, they become more withdrawn." Ben frowned. He'd seen this before, kids so used to rejection that they built walls higher than anyone could climb. It was a painful cycle, one that only got worse with time. As they walked past the common area, Ben noticed the other children playing quietly, their voices hushed in the presence of an outsider. But then his gaze was drawn to the farthest corner of the room. 2 small figures sat close together, half hidden in the shadows beneath a bookshelf. The twins. Their hair was the first thing that caught his attention, white as freshly fallen snow, almost unnaturally so. Even in the dim light, it seemed to glow. Their eyes were pale blue, wide with a quiet kind of knowing, as if they had seen far more than children their age should have. No one ever picks them. The whispered words from one of the caretakers drifted into Ben's ears, making his stomach twist. He watched as Mia's small hands clenched tightly around Max's, her entire body angled protectively toward him. They weren't just sitting together. They were holding on, bracing against the world. For a long moment, Ben couldn't move. Something inside him, something buried deep beneath years of grief, stirred. He should walk away. He wasn't a father. He had no business here. But then, Max shifted slightly, his voice so quiet it was nearly swallowed by the room. "Do we have to be good so you don't give us back?" The words shattered something inside Ben. A lump formed in his throat, too large to swallow. He didn't know these children, didn't know their story beyond what Grady had told him. And yet, in that moment, he felt as if he had been standing at this crossroads his entire life. He knelt slowly, leveling himself with their small, hesitant gazes. "No," he said, his voice rough but certain. "You don't have to be good for me to stay." Mia's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Skepticism, disbelief, maybe even the faintest glimmer of hope. Max clutched his sister's sleeve, waiting for her to decide. Ben took a steadying breath. He didn't know why he had come here tonight, but now he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving without them. A promise in the dark. The drive back home was silent. Ben could hear nothing but the faint hum of the heater, working overtime against the bitter cold outside. The twins sat in the back seat, pressed together so closely they might as well have been one person. Mia's small hand remained tightly wrapped around Max's, her body positioned just slightly in front of him, as if shielding him from whatever unknown awaited them. Ben caught their reflection in the rearview mirror. Mia's eyes weren't just watching the passing streets. They were analyzing, memorizing every turn, mapping an escape route. Max's gaze was different. He stared down at his lap, his fingers playing with the worn-out ear of his stuffed rabbit. Every few seconds, he would steal a glance at Ben, cautious but curious. Unlike his sister, he wasn't preparing to run. He was waiting to see if this was real. Ben's hands tightened on the steering wheel. It was real. Even if they didn't believe it yet. The house was quiet when they arrived. Ben pushed the front door open, stepping inside before turning to face them. "This is home now," he said, keeping his voice steady, gentle. "For as long as you want it to be." Neither child moved. Mia stood at the threshold like it was a trap, her sharp blue eyes scanning the space, taking in every detail. The furniture, the exits, the shadows. Max, on the other hand, hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. He shuffled forward, his sock-covered feet barely making the sound against the hardwood floor. His small fingers trailed over the edge of the couch, the old bookshelf, the wooden coffee table that had once belonged to Sarah. Ben watched him, swallowing the lump in his throat. Then he turned back to Mia. She hadn't moved. Her small hand was curled into a tight fist, gripping the fabric of her sweater. Her pale face betrayed nothing, but her shoulders were rigid, her feet planted firmly outside the door. Ben crouched down, careful not to make any sudden movements. "You can come in," he said gently. Mia's fingers twitched. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she stepped over the threshold. Ben exhaled, only realizing then that he'd been holding his breath. He shut the door behind them, locking out the cold. The twins remained on edge through dinner. Ben had made grilled cheese sandwiches, an easy, safe meal. But when he set the plates in front of them, neither child touched their food. Max sat stiffly, his fingers ghosting over the crust of his sandwich, but never actually picking it up. Mia, meanwhile, had pushed her plate slightly away, as if ready to abandon it the moment things went wrong. Ben sat across from them, not pushing, not questioning, just waiting. Minutes passed in silence. Then, without a word, Max grabbed his sandwich. He didn't take a bite. At least, not yet. But he held it, his fingers gripping the bread as if it might disappear. Mia's expression remained unreadable. Ben decided to break the silence. "You don't have to eat if you don't want to," he said casually, taking a bite of his own sandwich. "But there's plenty, so you don't have to save any for later." Max's fingers tensed. Then, slowly, cautiously, he took a bite. Ben pretended not to notice the way the boy's shoulders relaxed just slightly. Mia, however, remained still. She didn't eat, she didn't speak, she didn't move until the moment Max finished his meal. Only then did she pick up her sandwich. And even then, she ate with slow, careful bites, like she was testing each one. Ben didn't say anything. He just let them eat. Later that night, after he'd set up their room, Ben stood outside their door, listening. There was no sound, no whispered conversations, no movement. But he knew they weren't asleep. He had seen how Mia had looked at the beds, how she had barely stepped inside the room before quickly retreating. His chest ached as he imagined what they were doing right now, huddled in a corner, holding onto each other, waiting for the inevitable moment when everything fell apart. Ben took a deep breath. Then, without knocking, he slowly pushed the door open. Just as he had suspected, the beds were untouched. Instead, the twins were curled up in the farthest corner of the room, their small bodies pressed together, their plastic bags serving as makeshift pillows. Mia's eyes snapped open the second the door creaked. Max flinched but didn't move. Ben's heart clenched. They were waiting for him to tell them they'd done something wrong. Waiting for him to get angry. Waiting for him to send them away. Instead, Ben knelt down, keeping his movements slow, careful. "I know this is new," he said quietly. "And I know it's probably scary." Neither child responded. Ben glanced toward the untouched beds, then back at them. "You don't have to sleep there if you're not ready," he continued. "But I'll bring extra blankets in case you get cold." Mia stared at him, not trusting, not believing, but also not rejecting. Ben stood up, stepping out of the room. A few minutes later, he returned with 2 thick blankets. He knelt beside them again, draping one over their small forms, carefully tucking it around Max, then offering the second one to Mia. She didn't take it at first. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and pulled it around her shoulders. Ben exhaled. "I'll leave the door open a little," he said. "If you need anything. My room is just down the hall." Neither child spoke, but as Ben stood to leave, he saw it, the tiniest movement, so small he might have missed it if he hadn't been paying attention. Mia's fingers twitched. Not much, just enough to acknowledge his words. It was the smallest of victories, but it was a start. That night, as Ben lay awake in his own bed, staring at the ceiling, he thought about the words he had said to them earlier. This is home now, for as long as they wanted it to be. Ben had never been a father. But tonight, as he listened to the quiet breathing of the 2 children down the hall, he made a silent vow. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard it was, he would prove to them that home was more than just a place. It was safety. It was warmth. It was something you never had to be good enough to keep. A house is not a home yet. The first morning in Ben's house started in silence. Not a comfortable silence. Not the kind filled with the peaceful hum of a new day. This was something heavier, something that filled the space with the weight of too many unspoken fears. Ben stood in the kitchen, pouring steaming coffee into a mug. His movements were slow, deliberate, but his mind was elsewhere, upstairs, where 2 small figures were no doubt still curled in the corner of their room, waiting for the inevitable moment when everything went wrong. He had barely slept. He had checked on them 3 times throughout the night, and each time they had been exactly as he left them, huddled together, their plastic bags still within reach, as if ready to leave at any moment. Ben's chest ached. They didn't trust this. Didn't trust him. And why should they? Everything in their lives had taught them that nothing lasted, that adults left, that promises were broken. That hope was dangerous. Ben tightened his grip on his coffee mug, swallowing the frustration building in his throat. He couldn't change their past, but he could change this. He set his coffee down and took a deep breath before making his way upstairs. The bedroom door was slightly open. Ben knocked lightly against the frame before stepping inside. Mia and Max were exactly as he expected, curled up together in the corner, their backs against the wall. But now, their eyes were open, watching him, wary and waiting. "I made breakfast," Ben said, keeping his voice light. Neither of them responded. Max's grip tightened on his stuffed rabbit, his small fingers curling around its ear. Mia just watched him, silent, unmoving. Ben hesitated, then glanced at the untouched beds. He thought about pushing, about telling them they didn't have to sleep on the floor. But what would that accomplish? They didn't need more rules. They needed safety. They needed time. So instead, he simply nodded. "Come down whenever you're ready," he said. "No rush." Then he turned and left. Ben sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read the newspaper. Minutes passed. Then more. Still, no sign of them. He forced himself to stay patient. He resisted the urge to go back upstairs. Instead, he focused on his coffee, on the faint sound of birds outside, on the way the morning light streamed through the window. Then, finally, he heard it. Soft footsteps. Tentative. Hesitant. He didn't look up right away. He didn't want to scare them back upstairs. Instead, he continued reading, acting as if this was completely normal, as if it wasn't a huge moment. Then, when the footsteps stopped near the table, he set down the paper and smiled. Morning. Max stood just inside the kitchen, his stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in his arms. Mia was behind him, her small hands balled into fists, her eyes darting toward the front door, the windows, the exits. "Hungry?" Ben asked. Max nodded slowly. Mia didn't, but she didn't stop Max as he stepped forward, either. And that was enough. Breakfast was awkward. Max ate quickly, stuffing bites of toast into his mouth, like he wasn't sure when his next meal would come. Mia, on the other hand, barely touched her food. She sat stiffly, her small fingers gripping the edge of the table, her eyes flicking toward Ben every time he moved. She was waiting for him to change, waiting for the moment he lost patience, raised his voice, told them they had to follow his rules or leave. Ben could feel it in the way she sat, rigid, on edge. It made his stomach twist. "You don't have to rush," he told Max gently. "There's plenty. You can always have more." Max slowed slightly, his eyes flickering up toward Ben's before darting away. Mia, however, didn't react. Ben took a deep breath. Then, instead of pushing, instead of questioning, he simply started talking. Not about them. Not about the orphanage. Just about things. "The neighbor's dog keeps getting into my yard," he said casually, cutting into his eggs. "Big old golden retriever. Keeps stealing my newspaper. I think he's collecting them." Max looked up. "Like a squirrel?" he asked around a mouthful of toast. Ben grinned. "Exactly. I think he's building a nest out of them." Max giggled. It was small, barely more than a breath, but it was there. Mia didn't smile, but she listened. After breakfast, Max explored the house. He trailed his fingers over the bookshelves, the couch, the framed photos on the wall. Mia, meanwhile, stayed close to the door, watching everything, not touching anything. Ben gave them space. Let them wander. Let them get used to the idea that this was their home now. Then, after an hour of quiet observation, Mia finally spoke. "Where's her stuff?" Ben blinked. Mia was staring at the house, at the furniture, at the decorations. But her question wasn't about her. It was about Sarah. Ben swallowed. "Some of it's still here," he admitted, "but a lot of it's packed away." Mia didn't respond. She just kept looking, taking in the house, the empty spaces, the things that felt too neat, too untouched. She saw it. The absence. The missing pieces. Ben forced himself to breathe. "I kept the important things," he said. "The things that mattered." Mia studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Not in understanding, but in recognition. She knew what it was like to live in a place that held ghosts. That night, Ben expected them to sleep in the corner again. Expected the same silence, the same hesitation, the same distance. Instead, when he checked on them before bed, he found something different. Max was still curled up on the floor. But Maya was sitting on the edge of the bed. Not lying down, not relaxing, but sitting there, testing it, like she was seeing if it was safe. Ben stood in the doorway, his throat tight. He didn't say anything. Didn't make a big deal out of it. He just gave her a small nod. And for the first time, Mia nodded back. Later that night, Ben sat alone in the living room. The house was still. The snow outside was falling in soft, lazy drifts. He should have felt lonely. But he didn't. Not anymore. Because upstairs, in a small bedroom that had been empty for far too long, were two children who were just beginning, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had found a place where they didn't have to be good to stay. A place where they belonged. And for the first time in years, Ben Carter felt like he belonged too. The walls we build. The first cracks appeared in the middle of a snowstorm. The morning had started quiet, with thick snow blanketing the world in white. It was the kind of day that made the entire neighborhood feel like it had been frozen in time. Ben stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, steam curling from the coffee pot, filling the space with warmth. He had barely slept the night before, too caught up in the weight of what had happened. Mia had sat on the bed. Not in it, not under the blankets, not comfortable, but she had tested it. It was the first time she had allowed herself to interact with something that belonged to her. It meant something. It meant everything. Max was the first one downstairs, his stuffed rabbit clutched in one arm as he wandered into the kitchen. His hair was sticking up in all directions, his socks mismatched, and his eyes still heavy with sleep. Ben smiled. "Morning, kiddo." Max blinked up at him. Then, after a long pause, he mumbled, "Morning." It wasn't much, but coming from Max, it was monumental. Ben placed a plate of pancakes in front of him. The boy hesitated. Then, carefully, he reached out, grabbed his fork, and started eating. Slower than before, less frantic, less afraid that the food would be taken away. Progress. Small, fragile, but real. Ben had just poured more batter onto the griddle when he heard the soft footsteps at the edge of the kitchen. Mia. She stood in the doorway, her pale hands gripping the hem of her sweater, her blue eyes wary but alert. Ben didn't push. He just nodded toward the table. "Made pancakes," he said simply. Mia hesitated. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, pulled out a chair, and sat down. She didn't say anything, didn't reach for the food. But she sat at the table. Ben's heart ached. They were here. They were trying. The snowstorm came in the afternoon, thick flakes falling from the sky in endless waves. Ben had offered to take them outside, thinking maybe they'd want to build a snowman, maybe they'd want to play. But neither child responded. Instead, they stood by the window, staring out at the storm, their faces unreadable. Ben had seen that look before. It was the look of kids who had spent their lives waiting for change, waiting for the inevitable moment when things fell apart, waiting for the next rejection. Ben sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. He needed to do something, anything, something to make them believe this wasn't just another stop along the way. That evening, he found himself in front of an old cardboard box, dust clinging to its corners. It had been sitting in the attic for years, untouched, forgotten. Inside were pieces of a life he had once imagined, a future that had never come to be, a nursery that had never been filled, toys that had never been played with, Books that had never been read. Ben swallowed the lump in his throat and carefully lifted the lid. He wasn't doing this for himself. He was doing it for them. Mia found him first. She had wandered into the hallway, probably looking for Max, probably trying to keep herself busy, to distract herself. But then she saw the box. She stopped in the doorway, her small frame going completely still. Ben didn't look up. He was kneeling on the floor, sorting through the contents, small wooden blocks, a stuffed bear, a book of bedtime stories. "Thought you might like some of these," he said, keeping his voice soft, steady. "You don't have to take anything. Just figured. They shouldn't stay in a box forever." Mia didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. Ben exhaled slowly. Then he stood, brushing off his knees. "Anyway," he said, as if it didn't matter, as if he wasn't offering pieces of himself. "They're here if you want them." Then he left. That night, as Ben checked on them before bed, he noticed something different. The plastic bags were still there. The beds were still untouched. But in the farthest corner of the room, next to the place where Mia and Max had curled up together, something had changed. The stuffed bear was sitting beside them. It wasn't being held. It wasn't clutched in desperation. But it was there. And that was enough. The cracks were forming. The walls were shifting. They weren't ready to trust yet. But for the first time, they weren't running. And that was something. That was everything. The storm continued well into the night, the wind howling against the windows like a restless spirit. Ben lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. Not just to the storm. To the quiet. To the house that suddenly felt fuller, heavier, occupied in a way it hadn't been in years. To the presence of two small children down the hall, breathing, existing, staying. It was the first time in a long time that he felt the weight of something other than grief pressing against his ribs. It was something else now. Something fragile. Something alive. A house with ghosts. In the dim light of the early morning, Ben sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, steam curling toward the ceiling. He wasn't alone. Mia sat across from him. Not talking. Not eating. Just sitting. She had wandered downstairs a few minutes ago, her small frame barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. She hadn't looked at him at first, just stood in the doorway like a shadow, watching, measuring. Then, after what felt like forever, she had sat down. Ben didn't say anything, didn't push, didn't acknowledge the fact that she was here, voluntarily, without Max to pull her along. Instead, he just sipped his coffee, waiting. The silence stretched between them like a bridge half-built, reaching across a chasm too deep to measure. Then, finally, Maya spoke. "You talked to her." Ben frowned, glancing up. "Who?" Mia stared at the table, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing a knot in the wood. "The ghost." Ben inhaled sharply. For a second, he didn't know how to respond. Then, carefully, he set down his coffee. "There aren't any ghosts here," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Just memories." Mia's fingers twitched. "That's the same thing." Ben studied her. Her small face was unreadable, her blue eyes sharp with something beyond her years. She knew. She saw the absence. She saw the untouched spaces. She saw the ghost of someone she had never met. Ben swallowed. Then, slowly, carefully, he said, "She would have loved you, you know." Mia finally looked up. Her expression remained unreadable. But for the first time, she didn't look away. The art of staying. Mia didn't mention Sarah again. She didn't ask questions. Didn't push. Didn't need to. Because after that morning, something shifted. Something small, but noticeable. Mia started watching Ben. Not in the wary, suspicious way she had before. Not in the way she measured his movements, waiting for a sign that he would change, that he would snap, that he would send them away. She watched him like she was learning him. She watched the way he poured his coffee, The way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was thinking. The way he sat at the table every morning, staring at nothing, as if he was waiting for something that never came. And then, one morning, she did something she had never done before. She set the table. Ben had barely noticed at first. He had walked into the kitchen, still groggy from sleep, expecting the usual quiet, the usual hesitance. But then he saw them. Plates, forks, cups filled with orange juice, neatly placed, perfectly arranged. Mia stood by the counter, arms crossed, watching, waiting. Ben swallowed past the sudden tightness in his throat. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Mia shrugged. "I know." Ben pulled out a chair, sat down, didn't make a big deal out of it, didn't ruin the moment. Instead, he reached for his coffee and said, "Looks nice." Mia didn't respond, but she sat down across from him. And for the first time, the silence between them didn't feel so heavy. The first storm. Trust was a funny thing. It didn't come in big moments. Not in grand declarations, or promises, or official papers. It came in small things. In setting the table. In sitting at breakfast. In staying. But trust could also be broken in small things. And the first crack came on a Wednesday. Ben had been in the garage, fixing a leaking pipe, when he heard it. The sound of something shattering. The sound of something breaking. His heart stopped. He rushed inside, expecting to find something small. A spilled drink, a knocked-over chair. Instead, he found Mia standing in the living room, frozen, her face pale. At her feet, shattered into pieces, lay a picture frame. A picture of Sarah. Ben inhaled sharply. Mia's hands trembled at her sides. She stopped, clenching her jaw. She didn't explain, didn't make excuses. She just waited. Waited for the anger. Waited for the punishment. Waited for the inevitable. Ben stared at the broken glass, at the scattered pieces of the past. Then slowly he knelt down. Mia flinched, but all Ben did was pick up the frame. He turned it over, brushing away the glass, his hand steady. Then, without looking up, he said, "It's okay." Mia didn't move, didn't breathe. Her voice was hoarse. "I didn't mean to. I know." She stared at him. Ben didn't yell, didn't punish, didn't send her away. He just picked up the pieces. Mia swallowed. Then, hesitantly, slowly, she crouched down beside him and did the same. A new beginning. That night, after everything had been cleaned up, after the pieces had been thrown away, after the dust had settled, Ben sat in the living room. Mia sat across from him. Max was asleep upstairs, but Mia had stayed. She hadn't retreated to the corner of her room, hadn't curled up with her plastic bags. Instead, she sat here, in the living room, staring at the now empty space on the shelf where the picture had once been. Ben watched her carefully. She shifted uncomfortably. Then, after a long moment, she whispered, "I don't want to break things." Ben exhaled. "You're not breaking anything," he said. Mia looked at him. For the first time, really looked at him. And after a long, agonizing moment, she nodded. And that night, when Ben checked on them before bed, he saw something different. The plastic bags were still there. The stuffed bear was still there. But this time, Mia was in the bed. Not curled in the corner. Not sleeping on the floor. In the bed. And Ben stood in the doorway, his throat tight, his chest aching, and for the first time in a long, long time, he believed in something again. Because a house wasn't a home until someone chose to stay. And tonight, Mia had chosen. The art of trust. Snow blanketed the world outside, muffling the usual sounds of the neighborhood. The streetlights cast a golden glow over the frozen landscape, and the sky was a deep, endless black. It was the kind of night that made everything feel still, like the world had been put on pause. Inside, the house was warm, the soft crackling of the fireplace filling the silence. Ben stood in the kitchen, carefully stirring a pot of soup, his movements slow and deliberate. It had been a long day, a long week, really. And tonight, more than ever, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on his shoulders. Mia and Max had been quieter than usual. Not in the same fearful, uncertain way as before, but in a way that told him they were waiting. Waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for something to go wrong. Because things didn't stay good. Not in their world. Ben exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't stupid. He knew that trust wasn't built overnight. But damn, if he didn't wish he could just make them believe it. Make them believe him. Dinner was a quiet affair. Max ate slowly, pushing his food around his plate between bites. Mia barely touched hers. Ben had seen this before. The hesitation. The holding back. They were testing him. Not in the way most kids tested their parents. Not with tantrums or misbehavior, but in the way children who had been let down too many times tested everything. Would he get annoyed if they didn't eat? Would he take it personally? Would he change? Ben took a slow sip of water before speaking. "You don't have to eat if you're not hungry," he said casually, pushing his own plate away. "But there's ice cream in the freezer if you want some later." Max looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. Mia's fingers twitched around her fork. Ben didn't push, didn't force them to finish their food, didn't demand anything. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and changed the subject. "There's a bookstore downtown," he said, swirling his drink in his hands. "Has a whole section just for kids. Might be fun to check it out this weekend." Max perked up slightly. Mia, however, remained stiff, unmoving. Then, after a long moment, she finally said, "Why?" Ben raised an eyebrow. "Why what? Why do you keep trying?" The question caught him off guard. Not because he hadn't expected it, he had, but because she was finally saying it out loud. Finally voicing the thing that had been weighing on her since day one. Ben exhaled, setting his glass down. "I guess because I know what it's like to lose someone," he admitted. "And I know what it's like to feel like you'll never have a home again." Mia's grip on her fork tightened. Her blue eyes flickered with something unreadable. Max's gaze darted between them, nervous. Ben let the silence stretch. Let them process. Then, finally, Mia scoffed. "That's not the same." Ben tilted his head. "No," she shook her head. "Your wife died. That's different. She didn't leave you on purpose." Ben's chest ached. Because she was right. Because, no matter how much pain he had gone through, it wasn't the same. Sarah had never chosen to leave. But someone had chosen to leave them. And that was worse. That was so much worse. Ben nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, voice quiet. "It's not the same." Mia blinked, as if she hadn't expected him to agree so easily. "But I still lost her," he continued, "and I still had to learn how to live with it." Mia's jaw tightened. Ben hesitated, then said carefully, "I don't know what it's like to be you, Mia, but I know what it's like to feel alone." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, she stood up, grabbed her plate, and walked into the kitchen. Ben sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. It wasn't progress. Not exactly. But she hadn't run. She hadn't shut down completely. And that was something. Later that night, Ben sat in his study, flipping through an old book. He wasn't really reading, though. His mind was elsewhere. Then, just as he was about to turn off the lamp and call it a night, he heard it. Soft footsteps. Hesitant. Unsure. He looked up. Mia stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Ben straightened. "Hey." Mia shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Then, after a long moment, she finally spoke. "Can you teach me?" Ben frowned. "Teach you what?" She glanced at the book in his hands. "Reading." Ben blinked. "You don't know how to read." Mia's face twisted with something close to embarrassment. "I know some," she muttered, "but not everything." Ben's heart clenched. She was 7 years old. She should have been reading books meant for kids her age. She should have been laughing at silly stories, getting lost in fantasy worlds, learning. But instead she was standing here, in the middle of the night, asking a man she barely trusted to teach her something she had never been given the chance to learn. Ben swallowed. Then, without hesitation, he patted the empty seat beside him. "Come here," he said. "We'll start now." Mia hesitated. Then, slowly, she walked over. Sat down. Ben handed her the book. Watched as her small hands ran over the cover, as her fingers traced the title. She didn't open it right away. Didn't rush. Instead, she just sat there, the book in her lap, her eyes uncertain. Ben didn't push. Didn't pressure. Didn't make her feel like she had to do this. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, stretched his arms, and said, "You know, I wasn't always a great reader either." Mia glanced up. Ben grinned. "I used to mix up letters all the time," he admitted. "Drove my teachers crazy." Mia's lips twitched. Not a smile. Not quite. But almost. And then, after a moment, she opened the book. And just like that, another wall cracked. Another door unlocked. Another step was taken. And Ben knew, without a doubt, that someday, somehow, Maya would trust again. Even if she didn't know it yet. Forever is a promise. The first time Mia called him Dad, it was an accident. And it broke him. But before that moment came, before that tiny but earth-shattering word slipped past her lips, the road leading there was paved with careful steps, fragile trust, and a winter storm that changed everything. The storm that broke the silence. The first warning came early that morning. A news broadcast droning in the background, as Ben poured his coffee, his mind half-focused on the smell of cinnamon toast wafting through the kitchen. Blizzard conditions expected to worsen overnight, with temperatures dropping below freezing. Ben barely glanced at the screen. Winters here were always harsh. He took a sip of his coffee, only half listening, until Max shuffled into the kitchen, his stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. "Is it gonna be bad?" he asked quietly. Ben frowned. "The storm?" Max nodded, his fingers curling around the rabbit's worn ears. Ben shrugged. "Probably, but we'll be safe inside." Max didn't look convinced. He shifted his weight, chewing on his bottom lip, his small shoulders tight with an emotion Ben recognized. Anxiety, unease, the kind of worry that came from experience. And that's when it hit him. Storms weren't safe for them. Storms weren't just cold and snow and wind. Storms were nights spent in different houses. Storms were foster homes with broken heaters. Storms were the sound of slamming doors and whispered arguments in rooms they weren't meant to hear. Storms were abandonment. Ben put his coffee down. "Hey," he said gently, "come here for a second." Max hesitated. Then, slowly, he walked over. Ben knelt so they were eye level. "This storm isn't gonna change anything," he promised. "We have blankets, food, and a fireplace. We'll be warm. We'll be together. And I swear, no one is going anywhere." Max didn't respond. But after a moment he nodded. It was small, barely noticeable, but it meant everything. A house filled with light. By the time evening rolled around, the storm had settled over them in full force. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind howled like some restless thing searching for shelter. Ben had lit the fireplace, filling the house with a warm glow that flickered against the walls. Mia sat curled on the couch, a book resting in her lap, not reading it yet, but holding it, testing the weight of it in her hands like she was still deciding if it belonged to her. Max sat cross-legged on the floor, attempting to build a card tower. His tongue poked out slightly in concentration as he carefully balanced another card on top of the fragile structure. Ben watched them from the kitchen, leaning against the counter, a quiet sense of rightness settling in his chest. This This was what home should feel like. Not just a roof and walls, not just safety, but belonging. He didn't know when it had happened, didn't know when the house had shifted from being his to being theirs, but it had. And he never wanted to go back. The flashlight in the dark. It happened just after midnight. Ben had just dozed off when he heard it. A soft whimper. Barely a sound, but enough to snap him awake instantly. He threw back the covers, heart pounding, already moving before his mind fully caught up. The house was dark except for the faint embers still glowing in the fireplace. Then he heard it again. A sharp, panicked breath. A muffled cry. Ben's stomach twisted. Mia. He reached their room in seconds, pushing the door open to find her sitting up in bed, her breath coming fast, her small hands gripping the blanket so tightly her knuckles were white. Max was still asleep, curled against his pillow, completely unaware. But Mia's eyes were wild, darting around the room like she didn't know where she was, like she wasn't here at all. Ben's chest ached. She was caught in it. A memory. A nightmare. Mia, he said softly, kneeling beside the bed. It's okay. She flinched. Didn't look at him. Didn't move. Ben reached for the small flashlight on the nightstand, the one he had left there a week ago, just in case. He clicked it on and pointed it toward the ceiling, letting the dim beam fill the room with a soft, golden glow. See, he murmured. It's just us. Just home. Mia's breath hitched. Then, slowly, she blinked. Came back to herself. Came back to him. Her shoulders slumped. Her grip on the blanket loosened. Ben didn't touch her. Didn't push. Didn't ask. Instead, he just flicked the flashlight off and whispered, "Want to sit with me for a bit?" Mia hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she nodded. Ben exhaled, relief washing through him as he led her downstairs, the fire still crackling softly, filling the space with warmth. She curled up beside him on the couch. Didn't speak. Didn't cry. Just breathed. And for now, that was enough. The word that changed everything. Ben wasn't expecting it. Didn't see it coming. One moment, he was reading aloud from a book, his voice slow, steady, filling the room with quiet words. And the next, "Dad." It was barely a whisper, barely a sound at all. But it shattered something inside him. Ben froze. Mia went still beside him, her small body tense, like she hadn't meant to say it, like she regretted it instantly. Ben's throat felt tight, thick. He swallowed hard. Didn't move. Didn't breathe. Then, very carefully, he turned to her. Mia was already looking away, her jaw clenched, her fingers digging into the fabric of her sweater like she wanted to take it back, like she was afraid of what came next. Ben's heart ached. "Mia," he said softly. She didn't look at him, didn't respond. So Ben did the only thing he could do. He reached out, not to grab her, not to hold her, just to rest a gentle hand on hers. And then he whispered the only thing that mattered. "You don't have to say it." Mia's breath shuddered. She stayed silent for a long time. And then, slowly, she turned back to him. Her blue eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, looking for the inevitable disappointment. She didn't find it. Ben's grip tightened, just slightly. Reassuring. Steady. And then, finally, Mia nodded. Not much. Barely anything. But everything. The storm raged on outside. But inside, in the soft glow of the firelight, something fragile and unbreakable was taking shape. And for the first time in forever, Mia allowed herself to believe in something permanent. To believe in forever. To believe in family. And so did Ben.